Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining. I'm Jake Walker, and I lead customer education enablement here at Mode. Really excited to be hosting this webinar on small teams, big impact. We're joined by some panelists here in the data field who have some experience, either at early stage startups or where data's played an integral role in their growth. And so they're going to share some of their learnings and knowledge with us over the next 30-ish minutes or so. We'll leave some time for questions, so please be sure to insert any of your questions into the chat, and we'll get to those during the Q&A portion. So with that, go ahead and get over to our panelists and allow them to introduce themselves. So we'll go ahead and get started with Lily. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. My name is Lily Keck, and I am product operations at Balanced, which is a seed stage startup doing digital fitness for older adults. I am our data team. I also run our security program, so implementing HIPAA and SOC 2 security frameworks, and I'm really excited to be here.
Awesome. Thanks, Lily. Mira, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
For sure. Hey, everyone. My name is Mira Kanani. I am head of growth at Bento. Bento is also an early stage startup, enabling teams to create in-app guidance and onboarding that feels like part of your product rather than the traditional pop-ups and tours. At Bento, I work with our CEO on everything from sales, customer success, product. And given our small team, we really rely on data to prioritize across that bunch.
Awesome. Daniel.
Hi, I'm Daniel Sternberg. I lead data at Notion. Notion's your all-in-one connected workspace. I'm hopeful that many people here are familiar with Notion. My team at Notion includes data platform, data science, data engineering, and AI. I wouldn't say it's a small team today, but prior to Notion, I was the first data scientist at Gusto, built out the data science team there, and eventually led the data team over the course of that 6-year journey that I had. So I can speak to some examples of that experience as well.
Fantastic. And Perry.
Thanks. My name is Perry Wang. I work on data science and growth for Y Combinator. Spent a lot of time working with our early stage founders after they've gone through the batch, figuring out what is important to set up in terms of their data stack, what are the key metrics to look like. We don't have very much of a data team right now, but previously I built out the first analytics team and data engineering at Segment, going from 0 to 1, and did similar work at Intercom and Atlassian. Excited to be here.
Awesome. Well, we really appreciate you all taking the time to join us here and run through this. So we'll go ahead and jump right in. And whoever wants to answer this question initially, we can run around. But tell us about the data culture in your organization. How are you using data to drive growth currently within your org? Maybe Lily, actually, I'd be interested to hear from you on this. It's a super small team.
Yeah, so our entire company is about 18 people, I think. And one thing I've been really lucky to have is that curiosity is a trait amongst everyone. And so everyone really is interested in the data, and that helps kind of disseminate information throughout the whole team. We really value iteration and continuous growth. And so data is a part of pretty much every project, which has been really cool. So data is like the biggest thing for everyone, and it's really cool that everyone is really curious and wants to know about it.
That's really interesting, Daniel. You were at Gusto. You grew that team. How did you see the data culture evolve as the team got larger, from kind of where Lily's at to where the team got?
Yeah, for sure. When I joined Gusto, we had hired a couple other folks doing data work. It was a really tiny team, and we were kind of just getting like a data warehouse up and running and things like that. And actually, I think one learning we had there that I've taken with me from what didn't work for us, and I think one of the hard things in data a lot, it depends on the business obviously, is that people tend to invest in building out data teams at kind of like the growth stage of the company, not at the very beginning. Some companies do, but it's rarer unless you're a data product, or a product where data is like just part of the product experience. And so one of the things that's hard is like, I think what we did initially was, got a data warehouse up and running. We didn't have DBT back then, so we used like, I don't know, we just had Airflow and raw things running. Anyway, without going too much into that, I think we kind of like we boiled the ocean a little bit too much. We tried to give people self-serve access to lots really, really fast. Initially, that was kind of the plan that was already happening as I started there. And it created, number one, I think we were understaffed to support the infrastructure side of that. And number two, which was harder back then. And number two, we weren't really ready to support all of the different use cases across the company. There were about 300 people at Gusto at that point, because we had a large CX organization. And it was really hard because trust in data is this very kind of delicate thing, and you can start to feel, and my spidey sense is like much stronger than it was back then, for when people are starting to lose trust. And so we had both like infrastructure issues, and we had people were unsure of the data they were looking at because we tried to have all of these data models ready to go in Looker at the time. And it was really, really rough. And so one of the things I learned from that, as we sort of over time fixed on our BI team, and then on my team as well, was on the BI team was, let's focus on these core places in the business where we need to have really strong, rock solid reporting. And for us, that was really kind of on the growth side with our marketing team and to some degree sales, and get that to a really, really solid place so that people had trust in that part of the data at least. And then what I was more focused on, that was actually a different team at the time. I led that team later when we consolidated our data groups together. But on my team on data science, what we ended up doing was really focusing on the longer tail needs on product, where there was a lot of need for product insights about how people were using the product, what was working well, what wasn't. And I focused on hiring a small number initially of really, really strong product, like product analytics type data scientists on my team who were really, really good at cross-functional communication with their stakeholders. And I moved as quickly as I could to create a more embedded structure for those folks. Once I got buy-in, but I saw what was really amazing to see was once I had a few really good people plugged in the most key places for product analytics, which was with our kind of growth product team, and with a couple key kind of core product teams, that we got people really started to see the value, and we were kind of off and running and kind of building out that function.
Mira, I saw you shaking your head a few times. I'm curious to get your perspective on this.
Yeah, it's super interesting to hear Daniel's journey. I think we're at the very early stage of that journey, being sub 10 people at Bento. I think what's really fun about the culture at Bento right now is, yes, data is super important, and we try and be really intentional bringing it to every conversation, but we also have to be really creative about where and how we're getting and building out this data story. And so leveraging the variety of tools across sales, customer success, and our data warehouses and infrastructure to really craft and get the insights we need to, rather than having like a one-stop shop that's really, I guess, clear and trustable, as Daniel was talking about. So it's definitely a journey, but it's really fun to be at the stage where you have to be creative, and having everyone on board at that part is really fun.
Yeah, building data infrastructure, and the muscle memory that's associated with that at organizations of any size is really difficult, and it's really interesting to see how that like evolves when you come from a small core group of people, especially from that trust factor. Because when you're a smaller team, there's kind of some level of innate trust because you all are working very closely with one another. You kind of know where everything is just by default, versus that as it grows, there's net new people, they come from maybe the outside, and now all of a sudden there's this kind of shaky ground that maybe didn't exist before, and then you have to adapt around that. It's a difficult challenge to solve sometimes. Perry, I'm interested from the Y Combinator side. Is there any kind of difference there? I don't know. I mean, in that area, anything different from what the others have said?
No, I actually really resonate with what Daniel had mentioned, and everyone, the panelists across the board. We give founders much of the same advice. And when I was at Segment in 2014, this was before DBT, I had lots of conversations with the Mode team. Our transformation structure was a series of very janky create table, drop table statements written as saved mode snippets on a scheduled query that would run every morning at 8 o'clock in the morning. And I would get an email if it ran correctly. And if it didn't, I would hustle and try to fix what was broken. The big factor is really about focus, right? Like, what are the core tables the company needs? What are the core analytics and reports that are really important to the business? And yeah, as you build that relationship, getting the financial tables, the revenue tables in order, the core funnel tables in order, that gives the data team a ton of validation and trust to run deeper towards more complex experimentation, other parts of the business that are not sort of table stakes. And it really builds that reliability across the organization.
It's a really actually great segue into the next question I want to ask around kind of cross-functional relationships, because that's very much a challenge when a data team, whether a small team or big team. So I'm curious, what do those kind of relationships look like, and how are you building strategies off of those particular relationships, or how much involvement do cross-functional partners have in the evolution or usage of your data? And I mean, Daniel, you probably have an interesting perspective on this, being in multiple areas. So maybe I'll start with you, and then I'll kind of go around from there.
Sure. If I look at where I'm at Notion today, I think there's a few different kind of ways that we approach this. And it has some similarities to my last role as well. So first off, I think some of the most key partnerships tend to be, especially at most like startups, with kind of growth teams. It's a place where I think there's kind of the most leverage and impact that people can really measure of leveraging data more heavily quickly. And so, for example, I think about, we just had a new head of our growth product start here, and like really joining her with my data science lead for that growth team very quickly. Like, that relationship is a very key relationship. I think for a lot of data, for folks like myself who are leading kind of an overall data organization, there's key, obviously, connections to particular engineering functions. But in addition, I would say actually the finance organization tends to be a key area of cross-functional partnerships. So I work really closely with both our CFO, but also our head of business operations, our new head of strategic finance. Those teams have again, kind of core business data needs. Then within my product data science team, the partnership that those teams here and also in my last role tend to be a bit more embedded, and we have specific leads working. It's often like a very tight relationship with a PM lead, and then potentially with individual PMs at a different level of the organization. And so it tends to be that tends to be the structure on those teams. And then the kind of the growth side at Notion, there's two of them. At Gusto, it was more like there was one. Those relationships tend to be really critical as well.
I'm curious. You brought up the finance team, and I'm curious about that. I'm wondering how the relationship with finance has evolved, particularly as the data team grows.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the things, we're in a different phase here at Notion than by the time I left Gusto. I think one of the things that I saw change at Gusto over time was moving from a world where honestly, we did much more support on revenue work for, I would say, teams who needed to report on that daily, which tended to be more on the market, sales and marketing, go-to-market side. And finance kind of had its own process. Over time, I think those need to actually get more connected with each other. And over time as well, you start to see the finance organization outgrow some of the spreadsheet models that they've been using for some period of time. Literally, in some cases, they outgrow them because they're not accurate enough or timely enough. In other cases, they outgrow it because literally they can't run them anymore. And that's where I saw at Gusto, it was our BI engineering organization started to take on a much tighter relationship with the finance organization. Notion, things look a little bit different for a number of reasons that are technical, some of which are technical as well. But there too, I think, the one other place that I think data starts to drive more of this is the relationship between forecasting on data and kind of finance forecasting. you often end up building models out that over at scale that are inputs to the final forecast that finance team is running.
Lily, I'm interested in from a cross-functional standpoint at a much smaller organization. I would imagine that the relationship is very, very tight, but what's your perspective on that?
Yeah, so we're small, mainly single person departments. So communication between individuals is huge for like cross-functional relationships. And one thing that's a little bit different about us versus some of the other companies who are represented here is that we are D2C, and our tech product is actually just a vehicle for our product, which is workout videos. So there's the product of like the app itself and their stakeholders, but also figuring out who's taking class, how many classes are they taking, things like that. With our production side is a really interesting relationship to have as well, like predicting how many people will be in a live class or what attendance might look like for on-demand classes for the next month and how that impacts if people stay on the app and things like that. So I think it's a different nature than some of the bigger companies where the tech product is like the core of what they're offering. So I feel really lucky that I get to touch so many different departments because data is needed with a lot of them, but I think it's a really unique perspective when it's mainly just like one other person you're working with. And especially working really closely with our member experience team to figure out which quantitative numbers they're sending to us and what they're saying qualitatively to the member experience team, and try and figure out, if someone's not taking class, why is that happening? If they're taking a lot of class, what are they saying? And what do they like about it? Things like that. That's been really special.
Bring up an interesting topic in terms of just small teams in general, and you're saying one person departments, and curious to get everybody's take on this as well. But how do you prioritize your time? Obviously, as small teams, you are you. So how do you prioritize your time to meet the needs of the business when you have partners that are also other individuals that only have so much time?
It's a good question. Mainly trying to understand what the business needs are most at the moment, and looking at the product roadmap and the production roadmap and the marketing roadmap and figuring out which thing is happening the soonest. Usually it's like, this thing is launching tomorrow, so we need that today. And you can look at the longer term roadmap and try and plan what you might need, but generally it can be challenging, I guess, to prioritize and time manage, but communication really helps.
Communication, very much key. Mira, I'm curious from your perspective too. Yeah.
Totally. One approach we use that's been really effective is defining crystal balls and rubber balls every week. And so crystal balls are the things, and I'm sure many of you have heard of this, you can't drop, because if you drop them, it'll break something, it'll impact something really negatively. Whereas rubber balls are things that you can drop and pick back up when the timing is right. And that's been really effective because it ensures that you're focused every week and you know the things that you can't deprioritize versus the things that you can move around as naturally other things come up. And then to define a crystal ball, you need to have clarity on what the most important things are. And so that's where data really comes into play, because you're able to understand maybe what features are being used most commonly by your customers, or what qualitative feedback you've been getting from customers and prospects, and able to use that information to define those need to haves. And so yeah, that's worked really well for us.
That's awesome. It leads me to another question that I'll ask after I get to. I really want to hear from Perry too on this topic. How are you prioritizing your time, especially if you in your realm do you serve or are in service to several others that may not necessarily be a part of your org? I'm just curious how you prioritize your time.
Yeah, so a lot of the work that YC does are for founders, and I'll give some sort of in-house operator examples as well. We work with founders after the batch, so their priorities can be very different. Some founders might be focused on, hey, I need to drive growth and acquisition. Other founders are thinking through, how do I really tune and adjust product features to make sure that we have good market fit, and how do we get there? For us, it's really about focusing on how do we simplify the ways of growth and scale for these founders so that they really understand, hey, what are the key drivers of my company equation? What are the key levers that we really need to press on? And what are the levers that may not be as important? I think if you ask anyone here to sort of think about start to finish, what are all the inputs or outputs of a business, we might go on and on. It might be 1,000 nodes deep, but not all of them may be the most important. So a lot of the post-batch programs that YC runs help founders understand what are the levers, what are the most impactful ones, and focus on the ones that matter to the goals of the business today, and what set you up. I think to Mira's point, like there are rubber balls that you can drop and come back to, and there are crystal balls that are really urgent for today. And then you can sort of line those up as you think about the approach. I think similarly, when we were building out the team at Segment, very similar to Daniel's experience early on at Gusto, we try to solve analytics needs across the board, but really come back to what is the stack rank order of the most important data analysis or frameworks that you need to have, and build what you need. The 80-20 rule applies, and then move on to the next thing to keep supporting the business and demonstrating value and impact.
What I'm hearing is that processes are just as critical as technology. And I'm curious whether or not you think they play an equal or more prominent role to the tools that you have at your disposal. Go ahead.
I actually really think about what Mira said earlier, is that you have to be really intentional about this meld between process and technology. We have great tools in the modern data stack now, but it doesn't mean that you just sort of toss process out the door. But at the same time, when I was a more junior analyst, I didn't want to go through the process of things. I just wanted to get into the data and start cranking away. So there's a little bit of a balance, but I'm curious what other folks have to say.
Yeah, Mira, I wanted to come back to you because I'm curious on the processes are important. To Perry's point, especially when you're a little bit maybe more junior or green, you don't necessarily want to spend time on that because it's not super exciting. It's pretty dry at times. How do you get yourself kind of up and amped to build process around the things that you're doing, or take that step back and go, now that we've done this thing, we should codify it and kind of go forward from there?
Yeah, such a good question. I think the way I experience it the most is the first step of the process is, what question are you answering? And really, data is only as good as the clarity you have and what you're trying to get to. And so at any stage in the journey, really understanding why you need certain information and what strategic question you're trying to either get clarity on or color on. And so understanding those questions also then helps you determine what needs to be codified and turned into a process, because is it a one-time ask versus something you want to come back to and explore over the course of months, years, XYZ time? And so I think that's a big part of it. At an early stage, the other part of productionalizing or processifying stuff really comes back to the question of what do you rely on your gut /instinct /qualitative conversation for versus what do you need quantitative data for? And I think that's something that I think about a lot, because we want to be fast and nimble. It's so easy to go back to relying on your gut, but creating a framework for how do you make that decision, I think is something to be thought through sooner rather than later, so that you can impart that knowledge as your team grows and as things go further along.
Yeah, the art versus the science balance for sure. Lily, I'm curious. Are you, with your kind of individual departments, are you all making space to codify the things that you're doing, or is that something that is kind of we just got to get moving, and so we'll come back to that at a different time?
I would say different departments have different levels of procedure in place. For example, video production has a great amount of well-documented procedure in place. But someone like data does not necessarily have as much documented procedure in place. Although I do have processes that I go through with each thing. I think documentation is a big thing. It seems like most departments have a pretty well-oiled thing going where there is a process to do everything. But I think the next step in making that scalable is documentation, which I think is really important.
Yeah, it's also sometimes the most boring part of the work, writing it all down, especially data documentation, because it sometimes needs to be very, very specific. We'll shift gears a little bit. I'm curious, obviously, where the current kind of economic climate is a little sporadic, let's say, overall. Curious how that's impacted the ways in which you work. Are you seeing more or less appetite for leveraging data, that pendulum between that kind of gut versus science approach? Any changes in that at all? I'll start with you, Daniel, and then kind of go around the room.
Sure. So I don't think it's directly, at least on the team I'm on today, or my last role, in my last bit of time there, affected the demand for data at the company. I think what it has done, though, like I've been reflecting on it actually quite a bit over the last few months, and actually reflecting a little bit on what were some of the decisions we made during kind of the low interest rate period in the data world that we need to think more about now. And I think a couple of the things that have come to mind for me, kind of working at these kind of growth stage companies, is it was very common to see people grow pretty like largish armies of analysts and data scientists, analytical data scientists, a lot of companies. And I mean, I do think we have seen some evidence, suggestive evidence, that actually these teams are actually more deeply affected by some of the layoffs that have happened at companies recently. And I think part of the story there is less about, there's not demand for data, but like you do need to think about the ROI on the places where you put humans and also put a lot of effort into pipelines and data models. And so one of the things that I think I'm grateful to be at a company where we are in a good financial position, but also I think being thoughtful about where is it that we really do need to rely heavily on data, like we were talking about before, that prioritization. Where is it really important? It's not every single tiny feature we launch needs a ton of data and analysis behind it. There are many product quality things we do that do not need that, and we shouldn't spend our time on it. And in addition, I think at the same time, thinking about cost, which I think everybody's thinking about right now, you hire these armies of people, they build hundreds or thousands of DBT models, and your Snowflake costs actually rise quite rapidly, for example, for us. And I think that's another place where, and actually the thing I've realized about it is there's a vicious cycle there too, because all of that work is also often creating unacknowledged maintenance burden on your teams. So you can end up with data teams who have huge numbers of dashboards backed by pipelines that they're managing for tiny pockets of a company. And so we actually are going back and reviewing some of this now and basically saying, which of these do we actually want to keep? If we can get rid of some things that are only used in small places and do more one-off analyses and fewer like long-lived dashboards with pipelines in places where we don't need them and they aren't core, then we'll both make the team happier because they're going to feel less underwater, make our stakeholders happier because they're going to feel less blocked or friction getting help, and we're actually going to save the company money as well. And I do think we got a little bit out of whack with that in the last few years at a lot of companies. And I'm definitely seeing it as I talk to people, like we're hiring, et cetera, at companies where I'm shocked by the size of some of the teams that folks have had relative to revenue at some of those places. And so that is kind of what I've noticed. It's less about demand for data, but it's more about thinking about where the ROI is.
Yeah, it's interesting because like it's almost in times of somewhat unbridled growth, it can almost be as detrimental as times of kind of massive slowdown, in the sense that going really fast breeds inefficiency. And if you don't stop to create some of the processes around that and guardrails to protect, you may end up in a space where you have a bunch of inefficient operating flows, or federations of kind of micro universes that operate. And then you have to go back and clean that all up, which in and of itself is a cost too.
Yeah, the only thing I would add there quickly is like, and I think there's a timing aspect to this, right? So like, if I'm talking to folks, like many folks on this panel who are working at smaller companies, the first data person at those companies, you should be like, the process should mostly be your rigorous decision-making process about what is important and what is not, and aligning with your stakeholders on it. Like, I don't know that you need more process than that in the early days. I think what happened in the last few years was people got by with that approach for too long by just growing analyst teams really large before they thought about oh, we actually probably should have some analytics or data engineering to actually focus on the core areas and really make those strong, et cetera. And so I've seen that that play out. And again, it's just a timing thing. Like if you told me, your fourth hire is a data engineer, I'd be like, well, that probably makes sense. If you tell me your 15th hire or 20th hire is a data engineer, that seems like a problem.
Yeah, no, 100%. I agree. Perry, I'm really curious, what are you hearing in your world, and has the advice or direction you're giving founders changed at all as a result of the changing economic climate?
This might get me a little bit in trouble, but I generally don't recommend founders hire an analyst or a data engineer early at all. I think it actually pulls away from their focus on being obsessed about their own metrics. Like they should be obsessed about their own metrics and drive it as far as they can. Same thing with sales. Like founder-led sales are still a thing. You do it until you are going into every room, knowing exactly what to do every single time, and at that point you can't scale yourself anymore. You bring on an AE. So similarly on data, it's borrow resources from the team, make data a priority and shared ownership across product, across engineering, across growth, as the leader for the organization. I think what we see recently, and probably goes back at least like a year and a half at this point, definitely more focus on ROI, like Daniel mentioned, cost of acquisition, especially for top of funnel. You're really focused on, are we doing everything as efficiently as we can to grow? And that means you need good marketing and acquisition metrics. Product side, I think, is a little easier because you have good tools like Mixpanel, Amplitude, that all enable you to sort of out of the box look at metrics and behavior. So we definitely still recommend founders, obsess about your metrics, own them, drive ownership through the organization, be lean for as long as you can. And to Daniel's point, like don't throw process into it unless you really have to, and be thoughtful when you start to make that evolution in the org towards larger teams.
Mira or Lily, do you have anything else you want to add or talk about your all's experiences more recently?
The only thing I'll add that's a little different from what Daniel and Perry said is, I think what we're seeing is and I'm sure many people are seeing, is there's a higher burden of proof along the sales and customer success parts of the cycle. And so we're actually seeing an increased amount of, I'll call it data requests from our customers and prospects in terms of impact, customer case studies, what does success look like, what is ROI? And so that's led our priorities to shift to being able to answer those questions readily, scalably, and even have customers kind of self-serve those answers. And that ultimately leads to the product roadmap priorities shifting to really ensure that we have data integrations, testing, those kinds of things in place to be able to ensure our customers are seeing the success and ROI that they want to.
Lily, do you have anything else you'd want to add?
I think everyone did a wonderful job answering the question.
All right, awesome. Okay, well, we have about 10 minutes left, so we'll switch over to the Q&A portion. There's a whole series of questions that we got, so I'm just going to read these out in the order in which they came in, and we'll go from there. So this question's from Will, said, what are your thoughts on experienced practitioners and team leads skilling up into director or data head type roles? How does one begin to think about how to effectively build a data strategy, consider staffing, headcount, and data stack/software partnerships? Daniel, I feel like this might be a good question for you. So maybe if you want to take that one.
Sure. I mean, it's a journey. I'll give one piece of advice that's especially relevant, I think, at growth stage companies, which is where I've tended to work. And it's come up for me recently I may not be able to touch fully on the partnership side, but vendor and partnership side, because I actually think your teams play a big role there. I delegate a lot of those decisions within my team, and I just trust but verify, and get more involved on the budget side. I think in terms of like kind of preparing yourself for that type of role, what I think I reflected a lot recently as I've been doing some hiring of different types of leaders at Notion on my own experience and what I think my strengths are and where they came from. And I think one of the things that helped me actually was that, in my career, I spent about 3 years as an IC data scientist. And then I started managing a small team. And then I managed very small teams actually for probably 4 or 5 years before I really was in a position where luckily I had an opportunity to scale up a data science team and then eventually lead an overall data org. And I think actually that experience of being a player coach manager for a long time was helpful for me, because it actually forced me to be deep enough in enough different areas that at a growth stage company, I can zoom in and zoom out when I can look at things strategically, but I can also zoom in much deeper when I need to. And that's a hard skill to have. And I actually think during the kind of lower interest rate period, there are a lot of examples of folks who kind of scaled up almost too fast before they had an opportunity to kind of touch on marketing areas and product areas. And, I've worked on some fintech stuff as well. So it's just like a lot of different areas I felt like I could speak to last time I was looking for a job, for example. And so I think like making sure you have a good amount of kind of a decent depth across a number of different areas, I think is really critical to being like a leader of a data organization where you can kind of keep a level of like gravitas in all of these different areas. And I think it takes time. In terms of like zooming out to the strategic side, I think and kind of getting more strategic direction. I think what the example for me was we actually built a vision for data at Gusto before I took on a head of data role. And I kind of spearheaded the initiative to do it and built a really strong partnership with the different data functions. I was leading just data science at the time that I was working with in building that. And we'd worked together for a long time, but that was kind of the culmination for me that enabled me to kind of think more broadly, bring a group together to do that. And actually that was kind of what got me, I think, kind of a lot more buy-in for a role like that.
Awesome. Yeah. I had some similar experience, honestly, for that one. I used to be a head of data before I joined Mode. And I had a similar experience of getting to lead teams very early on, but being that kind of player coach type role. Context matters. If I could summarize, I think what I'm hearing you say is like context matters. So understanding what different verticals, different jobs people do within orgs is really important because it allows you to better understand and interpret the data and the information you're seeing and provide kind of feedback and partnership there. And then don't try to do everything yourself. Be open to collaboration within your own teams, trust your people, but also trust others around you. Being a head of data doesn't mean you make all data decisions, but it means that you provide a perspective that helps inform data decisions. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, I would agree with all of that. And like people don't actually know always how to work with someone in that role. And so the other thing I would say is you need to be, and I keep reminding myself of this, you need to be proactive about kind of telling the story outward to key cross-functional partners and leaders at the company about where are we going with data as an organization? Why are you making the specific prioritizations and investments that you're making right now kind of at the core level of how we work with data? It's easy to get stuck in the weeds of, and it's important stuff, but of the specific needs of a specific team or function at the company. But you also need to keep your eye on the ball in terms of that long-term message. And you have to actually repeat it a lot because people aren't naturally spending their time thinking about it.
Yep, that's a good point. All right, this one is from Marlene. With small teams, there tends to be some assigned roles and duties, divide and conquer, or nuanced roles. How do you all handle some duplication in knowledge, roles, or responsibilities with small teams? This is especially important if someone leaves the company or makes a move to another department. Mira, I'd be curious what your perspective is on this one.
Sure. I think we've talked a lot today about the balance between like art and science, process versus not process. And so I think that comes up here again. The one thing I will say is like you'll never regret documenting what you did and how you did it and like what query you use to pull that data, even if it's just for yourself when you're trying to redo that analysis 4 months later. And so a practice I try and use, and we use really across the company, is just over-indexing a little bit on documentation, really just to highlight why you're doing something and how you're doing something. And so that knowledge sharing becomes much, much easier when it becomes relevant rather than trying to reinvent the wheel when it comes up.
That's excellent advice. We have about a couple minutes left. I think we can do maybe one more question here. Let me see. All right, this is from Ethan. I'm a new PM at a fintech startup of 10 people. We don't have any data people, just me, a marketing manager, a head of UI UX, and our dev team. How should we be leveraging data? What does this look like in such a small, lean team? Lily, I feel like you might be kind of well equipped to answer this question.
Yeah, so we actually technically don't have a designated data person either. Technically, I'm product ops. And I would say making sure that it's a priority for everyone across the organization is really important. And that it's a part of all the conversations you're having. So leveraging it to guide decisions. And when you're initially, like have a few people on your platform, it can be hard to use those as like statistically significant, but they can still be like directional. So I would say where possible and wherever possible, try and add it in. And it can be hard if there's no designated person whose job it is. But if you add it into every conversation, it sort of becomes everyone's job, or at least everyone like cares about it. And so it can, I don't know what I'm trying to say here, but like having it available to everyone is really important.
Yeah, federating as much information as possible really matters. You don't need to be a data person. Everybody can be kind of a data person if the data is available.
Exactly.
Perry, I'm curious just on this, and then I think we'll have to wrap up. If you have any advice, just being in the space that you're in, and what you're giving to founders who likely have small teams and no data person.
Yeah, I think Lily's advice is spot on. Just find ways to insert data where it matters. If you're the PM, understand the product, understand the steps in that journey from like when you first enter the funnel to onboarding to activation to retention. Map it out. That's the art part. Like, go into Figma, go into Notion, like draw it out. And then once you map it out, understand where the levers are, right? And then track those metrics. Your engineering team is really excited to join you on that journey, but it's really hard to figure out where to start. But if you can collaboratively work together to map it out, it's, that art part is can bring the team together, and you can all really have a good, clear picture on what matters and how to track it.
Awesome. All right. Well, I think that's all of our time. So I just want to thank you all again for joining us and really sharing all of your experience and insights. This was incredibly valuable for me. Hopefully everybody on here also got a lot of value out of it. Thank the audience. Thank you all for joining. I don't know how many people were on, but thank you very much. And as a reminder, the recording for this will go out shortly. So thanks again. Everybody have a wonderful day.